Alright, so here we are again. I'm Chip, and we're going to be talking about the props in this particular video. But before we do that, whoops, we're going to have a path in there too, so let's get that path. There we go. So this is the current version of our map. Preview underscore section underscore 02. So now we can start seeing our progress, and I would highly recommend you to do the same thing after every session, because from a motivational point of view, making a map takes a lot of time, and sometimes it's very difficult to see the changes. And by doing this, you can clearly see the progress that's being made while you're spending hours and hours and hours on this one map that you're trying to build. Anyway, here we are back in the editor. Just a quick recap of some of the hotkeys that we've had. Spacebar to rotate, translation with the middle mouse button clicked, and then rotating the middle mouse button, scroll wheel to zoom in like in Spring Commander. So previously we looked at the terrain and we looked at markers, and we were talking about how we can use the markers to reward certain type of gameplay from the player. And in this video we're going to be talking about the same thing, but then with props. Props in the end reward players for reclaiming them, or for securing them, or for contesting them. And we can place the props across the map to kind of help the player determine where it should move its units to. Right, so because this is, for example, an open area, and there's no particular reason at the moment to have your tanks here over there, or to have them here. And we kind of want to add that reasoning for the player. And we can do that by going to props. In edit, you can select and edit individual props. The selection circle doesn't work until you actually have props. And then here you can go on this little plus sign, and then given the theme, you can start adding props here. Now, this map is going to be a snow map with Oasis, hot Oasis. So we're going to be having a lot of tundra props. And in particular, we're going to be having these snow trees. These three groups here, right? Yep, there we go. All right. And what do we have, right? When we look at reclaim, there's a couple of things. First of all, they can give you energy. So for example, given that our hydrocarbon planet is really far away, we could add some tree reclaim here to help the player with his initial potential energy stall. Another thing that reclaim adds is mass. So we could add rocks along the route, or we could add rocks to a bit more unknown places like here. And by doing so, we give the player an initial incentive to go here, while during the later stages, this part of the map may not be interesting at all. Similar for this place right here. Right, but we fix that in this case with this mass extractor. And that's pretty much it. Then everything that we discussed with extractors also applies to props. So by placing props at certain places, you're rewarding the player for certain behavior. For example, as we mentioned, if we add a lot of energy reclaim here at the start, we're rewarding the player by using one of the first few engineers to reclaim these three groups, so that he can delay his hydrocarbon plant, or so that he can build a second factory before building the hydrocarbon plant, and etc. So let's start thinking about that. We've got the pine trees here. Now note that these pine groups are very mass heavy. It's 10 per group, so we shouldn't use too many. Okay, that's a lot of pine groups. Now if we misplaced, Ctrl-Z doesn't usually really work. Just gotta remove them again, just like that. And here we have a bunch of settings. Free rotation allows us to rotate them as we see fit. And then we've got this place on grid. If you turn it off, it's a very smooth translation. But if you turn it on, then it tries to place it in the center of a build grid. So if you go to Tools, Build Grid, and it tries to place it in one of those centers like that, you see? So usually for props, you don't want them to look too specifically placed because that looks bad. You kind of want to add that little bit of randomness to it so that it looks more natural, because that's in the end what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with nature, so it has to look natural-ish. Anyway, back to props in general. Let's say we're just going to add some areas here and see how that rolls out. Again, these are worth a lot of mass, right? So we should probably use them a bit more sparingly. And what's really important here is that we don't want to clutter the entire map with tree groups, because you don't want the player to have to make the decision on whether or not they should crush the tree group. Right? Crushing means that an engineer crosses, or some unit tries to walk over the trees to get to some point, and by doing so they crush the tree group. And crushing means that they get into this collision box, and then instead of having a tree group, you have individual trees. And that's pretty bad if that's done a lot on purpose. But for the sake of it, we're going to be... on one end, it's very bad if you would make this entire region made of props, because A, there is no tactical reward anymore to the player, right? If the entire region is made of very valuable tree groups, then I'm pretty sure that the first engineer is just going to start reclaiming those tree groups with a factory attack, and the command unit is going to keep pumping out factories. So that's not very interesting, but we kind of want to place them sparsely. And sparsely, with that I mean that we allow the tree groups to create these natural routes through the terrain, right? And by creating these natural routes, we can kind of tell the player, hey, move like this so that you don't crush the tree groups. Now this is going to be a hot oasis, so placing these fellas here is going to be a bad call, but we can place them maybe somewhere here again, and then somewhere there, and then somewhere here. Yeah, something like that. Somewhere there maybe, and here, and then down here. All right. And then comes the part where we have to tweak these tree groups to make them look more natural, more good, and to make them more friendly towards the player. So in this case, it's just about making them look more coherent, right? This is a bit of a mess, so let's not do that. Usually tree groups like to stay together. And this is going to be a little, just like that. It's going to be a tiny little tree there area. I'm going to create more there. And then there's here some in the center. Right, and you can see already that this is going to take up some time. To do this right, it's going to easily take up a lot of time. So I'm going to do a few as an example, and then the remainder of the video, I'm just going to speed that up. Because I don't think it really adds value that you're going to watch me do the same thing over and over again. But it does add a lot of value to that you can see me actually spend a lot of time on this, because that is just simply put what's going to take, right? It's just going to take a lot of time to get this right. Now, one small interesting fact is that this is a hydrocarbon plant, which means water, and considering that we consider this to be hot water, I don't think these trees should be too close to that, because there's going to be green trees on top of that. Is this possible? Yes, it is. But we're going to block this path with these tree groups, not because they block pathing, but because you would break the tree groups. Same thing here, we can place these down here. And by doing this, we kind of reward the player for having a little bit more interesting routing in terms of his units. If he's a factory here and he puts a rally point there, then they're gonna block these. You're gonna crush these 3 groups, right? But if he would make them move through here and then there, then we reward him for the fact that he's thinking about his queues, about his factory roll-off commands. All right. Starting to look like something. Again, this is secretly a pathway, but we don't want it to be used that much. And that's pretty much it for the for these little trees here. So starting from this point, which is 10 minutes 45, I'll be speeding up the video until I'm done. All right, so 4 minutes later, this is a point where we're going to be making a choice to... Oh, that's interesting. These are actually not existing on the other side. I'll be making a choice to break symmetry. because the reason is that the symmetry line is here across this axis here in the center, and all these tree group bits here, they look very unnatural because of that symmetry line. So what we're going to be doing is break symmetry, but still kind of keep them in the same evenly spaced manner so that we can break with the symmetry of the map without really influencing how the map plays out. Right, and by all means, this is so much into the contest area that really small changes, they don't really matter at this point anymore. Anything in the spawn should be completely identical, but likely there's going to be racks here all over the place anyway. And those are going to be way more valuable than these tree groups are ever going to be. So there's me breaking. Okie dokie, let's put some down there too. These are very difficult to get to, so. And there we go. I'll move this one here a bit. And now we're getting closer and closer to the spawn, right? So we should stop trying to mess with what we're doing. Right, so let's increase the brush size slightly. Let's mess with this area here. Just adding some trees to it. There we go. And what I kind of want to make here is a path in the center. So that, there we go. So that we can toy with that path. All right, and then here again, this corner here. And there we go. Grouped up a bit. And the same thing here. There we go. All right, so what do we have? We have a, I think I'm just going to remove this group here. Yeah, that looks better. Maybe shouldn't be a pathway here in the center. We're just going to put it like that. That looks fine to me. Move you to the other side. All right. Looking good. All right, and that's it for this tree group type, right? Now we're just going to remove the actual groups and work with the individual trees because they allow for a lot more natural placement that doesn't have to be symmetrical, because quite simply these are usually not worth getting in the average game. Right, so that makes it a lot easier to work with because we don't have to worry about the symmetrical aspects of everything. We can just kind of place them and now what is usually useful is that you start placing these with the symmetry tool so that you don't forget that one area has trees and the other area does not. because that does look bad in some sense, right? Because currently there's no trees here, so let's add a few of those. Let's turn on the symmetry real quick and place some smaller tree groups around this water area here. Oh, not up there though. Right, we can keep this open. Just tiny tree groups, pretty nice. All right, and then we gotta work with some of the other props. So let's start looking at that. There we go. And this is gonna be evergreen without the 2. We've got these really large, lush oak trees here that I'm a huge fan of, so let's place those. Again, note that these are worth a lot of mass. But what we can do with those larger oak trees is really populate and make this look, from a prop perspective, like a Oasis, right? Because that's what we're aiming for. And similarly, we should have some dead trees from lava. There we go. And the reason we should have some dead trees as well is because not all the trees that used to be here can actually take that lava, the heat, or the heat of the water. Right? Not everything can take it. All right, so let's tweak this up. We have some trees here, and then we add some dead trees to it. Note that tree groups, they can hover because their height is determined by the center of the group. So we kind of don't want these tree groups on anything like a slope, because that just makes them look bad. We also can't, sadly enough, scale them. Now this is one of those moments where it may be interesting to change the terrain very slightly, there you go, to match our tree group here so that it doesn't hover. Right, this is that iterative process that we were talking about at the start. Note that this doesn't really matter because some of them disappeared. Just to make it more difficult to build the point defense we were talking about, let's put down some dead trees. There's some dead trees very close to the water. Alright. This is way too steep. Let's put them up here instead. Oh. Alright. Now the other way around works too, where the tree starts moving into the terrain. That's usually not as bad because then they don't look like they're hovering, like this one. So that doesn't really matter that much. From a player perspective, it's just a shorter tree at that point. These guys here are having a tough time. Got some smaller trees here. Again, having a tough time. Larger tree group. Make sure they're not flying. Alright. Now, there usually, as I said previously, you don't want these tree groups to block the pathing. In this case, we're choosing to make it block the pathing because it's an Oasis. So let's add more smaller trees here to the mix. Evergreen. I lost all the images except for the ones that I chose. So that's nice. There we go. Let's add some more smaller trees. So let's add all of that in. Yep. All right. Slowly but surely starting to look like something here. All right, that looks pretty decent. Got some nice tree placement here. Now this isn't very tactically rewarding or anything, but it's gonna make it aesthetically more pleasing in the end. That adds to the game too. And last but certainly not least, we have another type of prop that is usually very interesting to place, and that's the rocks. Right? We're going to be placing. Again, we got to be careful about placing rocks because it really tells the player where to move to in the game. Where should my engineers go to? What areas should I try to protect, etc. So that's always a bit tricky, but let's just make it work. We can go to Paradise, Props, doesn't exist. We can go to Tropical, Props, let's go. And here we have these darker rocks. Let's place not that many. But I'd like to have these darker rocks given that this is an Oasis. And I think it's gonna look pretty good on the fact that this is gonna be an ice map, so we have some darker rocks on that map. It's gonna be pretty. Not really sure where to put these yet, but we'll find out. And then we have all the smaller rocks, right? The other interesting stuff. And usually you kind of want to place these near cliff areas. Whoops, that's really big. That's the bug I was talking about, where it doesn't remove the rocks. It's very annoying. All right. Oh, right. We were considering this as a hotspot too, so let's fix that in a bit. Just gonna add some tiny rocks everywhere. And maybe some more interesting, besides in the water, some more interesting rock areas. But let's fix these up a bit before we continue on doing that. Let's maybe add one of these bigger rocks. Control C, Control V to copy paste. Let's add that right there because that seems to fit in really well. Now rocks shouldn't be placed uniformly because that looks bad. Players can see that. Looks very artificial. Just place them where they seem to fit in. Doesn't have to be everywhere. These little rocks can reward the player for going back here to get some reclaim. This is way too many rocks, so let's remove some of those. Gotta keep in mind that the extractors or the trees are already worth a lot. Right, so that's. And again, if you, for example, look at rocks like these three here, if the player is gonna take this mass extractor anyway, he may just as well queue up these little rocks, right? And that rewards the player for being more responsive to the environment, for taking that into account. That's why I put those there. And that's essentially all of map development. How can I reward the player for playing the map? All right. That's what matters most. let's see. I think this is pretty decent. We gotta fix this little prop issue here, where we mentioned that this was going to be an Oasis, and now we're not really making it an Oasis. So let's, ooh, not the big tree group, no groups. Let's add in our little trees. And one very common mistake that I make is to forget to turn on symmetry mode again, and then you find out after 30 minutes. Don't do that. It's really annoying. Alright. Another few hiccups that people can make. Don't put props on on resource spots. It's really annoying usually. Just keep those free of reclaim, of props, etc. It makes the game a lot more easy. You can put things next to it if you want to reward the player for adding that little bit of. Right, you can do something like that to reward the player for adding that little bit of additional clicks when building, when constructing a cube. But the map is starting to look like something, but we're still really working on a blank map, right? It's just all sand. So that's what we're gonna be tackling in the next section, where we're gonna start adding some textures to the terrain to really make it more shiny.